The dinner rush at Bella Vista had finally begun to slow, leaving Ava Moretti with a few precious moments to catch her breath between tables. She smoothed her black apron and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, surveying the elegant dining room with its warm amber lighting and soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers. After 3 years working here, she still felt a small thrill at being part of such a refined establishment, even if her bank account reminded her daily that she was barely scraping by. Have you ever worked in a restaurant where every detail mattered, where one small gesture could change someone's entire evening? The pressure never really goes away, but sometimes magic happens in the most unexpected moments. Ava noticed the elderly gentleman immediately when he shuffled through the mahogany doors, his weathered hands gripping a worn walking cane. Something about his lost expression tugged at her heart. He appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair neatly combed and a pressed shirt that spoke of old-world dignity despite the confusion clouding his pale blue eyes. The hostess, Jennifer, approached him with her practiced smile, but Ava could see the interaction wasn't going well. The man gestured helplessly, his mouth moving in what seemed to be a foreign language, while Jennifer's smile grew increasingly strained. Other diners began to notice the commotion, their conversations pausing as they turned to observe the elderly man's growing distress. Ava's heart clenched. She had seen that look before, the panic of being unable to communicate in a place where you desperately needed help. Without thinking, she abandoned the wine glasses she had been polishing and moved toward the front of the restaurant. As she drew closer, she caught fragments of what the man was saying, and recognition sparked in her chest. Italian. He was speaking Italian, his voice trembling with frustration as he tried to explain something to Jennifer, who could only offer apologetic shrugs and gestures toward the menu. Signore, she said softly, approaching with gentle steps. Posso aiutarla? Can I help you? The transformation in the elderly man's face was immediate and profound. His eyes, which had been clouded with confusion and embarrassment, suddenly brightened with relief and gratitude. He turned toward her completely, abandoning his failed attempts to communicate with Jennifer. Grazie, mia cara, grazie, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I am so lost. My grandson, he brought me here for my birthday, but he had to step outside for a phone call. I wanted to order something special, but I cannot make them understand. Ava felt her heart expand with tenderness for this vulnerable man. She had learned Italian from her grandmother, Nonna Rosa, who had insisted that the language was the key to their heritage, to understanding where they came from and who they truly were. Now, watching this gentleman's relief at finally being understood, she felt her grandmother's wisdom in every word. Of course, she said in perfect Italian, her voice warm and reassuring. What would you like to celebrate with tonight? I know our menu very well, and I can help you find something truly special. From somewhere behind her, Ava felt the weight of observation, as if someone was watching their interaction with particular intensity. But she pushed the sensation aside, focusing entirely on the elderly gentleman who was now smiling with the first genuine happiness she had seen from him. The man's name was Giuseppe, and he had emigrated from Sicily 60 years ago, but still dreamed in Italian, still felt most himself when speaking the language of his childhood. As Ava listened to his stories of his late wife's birthday traditions, of the specific dishes that held memories for him, she found herself transported. This was why she loved Italian, why her grandmother had been right to insist she learn it properly. It wasn't just words, it was connection, heritage, the bridge between generations. Giuseppe wanted osso buco, he explained, because it had been his wife Maria's favorite, and tonight marked what would have been their 55th wedding anniversary. His grandson had chosen this restaurant hoping to create new memories, but Giuseppe had been overwhelmed by the unfamiliar menu and the inability to explain what he needed. Ava felt tears prick at her eyes as she assured him that their chef prepared magnificent osso buco, that she would speak to the kitchen personally to ensure it was perfect. She helped him to a quiet corner table with a view of the small garden, where he would be comfortable while waiting for his grandson's return. As she settled Giuseppe with a glass of Chianti and a promise that his meal would be extraordinary, Ava became acutely aware again of being watched. She turned slightly, and her gaze collided with the most intense dark eyes she had ever encountered. At a corner table, partially hidden in shadow, sat a man who looked like he belonged in a different world entirely. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with thick black hair and olive skin that suggested Italian heritage. His suit was clearly expensive, the kind of tailored perfection that cost more than Ava made in several months. But it was his eyes that caught her breath, dark and penetrating, watching her interaction with Giuseppe with an expression she couldn't read. Heat crept up Ava's neck as she realized he had been observing her conversation with the elderly man, had heard her speaking Italian with fluent ease. Something about his attention made her simultaneously nervous and inexplicably drawn to him. He had the bearing of someone used to command, to having his presence acknowledged and respected. She forced herself to look away, returning her attention to Giuseppe, who was already looking more relaxed as he sipped his wine and gazed out at the garden. But she remained hyper-aware of the mysterious man's continued observation, of the way her skin seemed to tingle under his scrutiny. When Giuseppe's grandson arrived, full of apologies for his extended absence, Ava helped facilitate their reunion and ensured their dinner order was placed with special attention from the kitchen. Giuseppe insisted on kissing her hand in gratitude, telling her in rapid Italian that she was an angel sent by his late wife Maria, that her kindness had saved what could have been a ruined evening. As Ava returned to her other duties, she noticed the mysterious man signaling for his check. She approached his table with professional composure, though her pulse quickened as she drew near. Up close, he was even more intimidating and attractive, with sharp features and an aura of barely contained power. "The meal was excellent," he said, his voice deep and smooth with just a hint of an accent. "But the service was extraordinary." His eyes held hers as he spoke, and Ava felt something electric pass between them. There was appreciation in his gaze, but something deeper too, something that made her feel seen in a way that was both thrilling and unsettling. "Thank you, sir," she managed, proud that her voice remained steady. "I hope you'll visit us again." He handed her a leather folder containing his payment, but when she opened it later at the service station, her hands began to shake. Inside was not only payment for his meal, but a black credit card that looked unlike anything she had ever seen, along with a tip that was more than she typically made in an entire week. The name on the card read Dante Caruso. Dante Caruso returned the very next evening. Ava spotted him immediately as he entered Bella Vista, that same commanding presence that seemed to shift the energy of the entire restaurant. He wore a different suit, charcoal gray this time, but carried himself with the same quiet authority that made other diners instinctively lower their voices when he passed their tables. Her pulse quickened as the hostess led him to a table in her section. This couldn't be coincidence. Wealthy men like him had dozens of upscale dining options throughout the city. Yet here he was, requesting the same corner table he had occupied the night before, his dark eyes scanning the room until they found her. "Good evening, Mr. Caruso," Ava said as she approached his table, proud that her voice remained professional despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "Welcome back to Bella Vista." A slow smile curved his lips, transforming his severe features into something almost boyish. "You remembered my name." "It was hard to forget," she admitted, setting down his water glass with steady hands. "That was quite a generous tip you left last night." "Generosity had nothing to do with it," Dante replied, his gaze holding hers. "You showed kindness to an old man who needed help. That deserves recognition." Something in his voice, the way he said recognition, sent warmth spreading through Ava's chest. She had spent 3 years serving wealthy customers who barely acknowledged her existence, treating her as an extension of the furniture. Yet this man, who clearly moved in circles far above her own, spoke to her as if her actions mattered, as if she mattered. "I was just doing my job," she said, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. Helping Giuseppe had felt like so much more than duty. "No," Dante said quietly. "You were being yourself. There's a difference." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, making her heart skip in a way that felt dangerous. She should take his order, move on to her other tables, maintain the professional distance that kept her tips steady and her emotions safe. But something about Dante Caruso made her want to linger, to discover what lay beneath that intense exterior. "Have you decided what you'd like tonight?" she asked, though he hadn't even glanced at the menu. "Surprise me," he said, leaning back in his chair with an ease that suggested he was accustomed to being in control of every situation. "Choose something you think I'd enjoy." The request felt intimate somehow, like he was asking her to reveal something personal about herself through her recommendation. Ava found herself studying his face, trying to read the preferences of a man who remained largely a mystery. "You seem like someone who appreciates tradition," she said slowly. "Our chef makes an incredible brasato al burrolo. It's a Piemontese dish, very authentic." Dante's eyebrows rose slightly. "You know your Italian cuisine. My grandmother insisted I learn about our heritage," Ava explained, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. She said food was the language of memory. "A woman of wisdom," Dante agreed. "What else did she teach you?" Before Ava could stop herself, she was telling him about Nana Rosa, about the Sunday afternoons spent learning to make fresh pasta by hand, about the stories of the old country that came with every recipe. Dante listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed genuine interest in her family history. "She comes from Abruzzo originally," Ava found herself saying. "A little town called Roccascalegna. She used to describe the mountains there like they were alive." "I know Roccascalegna," Dante said, and something in his voice shifted. "My own family has connections to that region. Perhaps our grandmothers knew each other once, in the old country." The possibility sent a shiver through Ava, as if invisible threads were connecting them across time and geography. She realized she had been standing at his table far longer than appropriate, that other guests were beginning to notice her neglect of their needs. "I should let you enjoy your dinner," she said, stepping back reluctantly. "Ava," he called as she turned to leave. She stopped, surprised to hear her name on his lips. "You're working too hard for too little. If you ever need anything at all, you can call me." He slid a business card across the table, elegant black cardstock with simple white lettering that read only his name and a phone number. No company, no title, nothing to indicate what kind of business he conducted. "Thank you," she said, pocketing the card though every instinct told her to leave it on the table. "That's very kind, but I'm fine." But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The cheap heels that made her feet ache, the second-hand uniform that she mended herself, the shared apartment with 2 roommates in a neighborhood where she didn't feel safe walking alone at night. None of that was fine, and something in Dante's expression suggested he understood exactly how not fine her situation really was. Over the following week, he returned every other night, always requesting her section, always ordering something different based on her recommendations. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, revealing layers of connection that had nothing to do with customer service. He told her about his own grandmother, Nana Francesca, who had crossed the ocean with nothing but recipes sewn into the lining of her coat. He spoke of family traditions maintained across generations, of the weight of carrying forward the customs of people who had sacrificed everything for a chance at something better. But beneath the charm and cultural connection, Ava sensed something darker. The way his phone calls were always answered immediately, regardless of the hour. The deference shown to him by other wealthy patrons who usually treated restaurant staff as invisible. The expensive watches and perfectly tailored clothing that suggested wealth far beyond what any legitimate business could generate for someone his age. Jennifer, the hostess, cornered her during a quiet moment near the service station. "Be careful with that one," she warned, glancing toward Dante's table. "Men like him don't date women like us. They have arrangements." "What do you mean?" Ava asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. "Rich guys slumming it with the help," Jennifer said bluntly. "It never ends well for girls like us. We're entertainment, not relationship material." The words stung because they echoed Ava's own fears, the voice in her head that whispered she was foolish to read anything meaningful into Dante's attention. Men in $1,000 suits didn't fall for waitresses struggling to pay rent. That only happened in movies. But when she looked across the dining room and found Dante watching her with an expression of such focused intensity that her breath caught, Jennifer's warnings felt less important than the electric connection arcing between them. That night, after the restaurant closed and she was walking to her bus stop, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Dante approaching, his hands in his coat pockets, and something almost vulnerable in his expression. "This neighborhood isn't safe for you to walk alone," he said without preamble. "I've been managing fine for 3 years," Ava replied, though her heart was racing for more than just the surprise of seeing him. "Let me drive you home," he offered. "Please." The please did something to her resolve, made it impossible to maintain the professional distance she knew she should keep. She found herself walking toward his car, a sleek black sedan that probably cost more than she would make in 5 years. As they drove through the city streets, the silence between them felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. When he pulled up outside her building, a converted warehouse in a gentrifying neighborhood that was still more rough than refined, Ava saw him take in the graffitied walls and broken streetlights with an unreadable expression. "Ava," he said as she reached for the door handle, "I'd like to take you to dinner. Somewhere other than Bella Vista. Somewhere where you can be a guest instead of working." She turned to face him fully, studying the sharp planes of his face in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. Every rational thought told her to say no, to maintain the boundaries that kept her safe. But her heart was already answering before her mind could catch up. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. "I'd like that very much." Dante chose Luna Rosa, a restaurant tucked into a narrow street in Little Italy that Ava had walked past hundreds of times but never dreamed of entering. The kind of place with no visible menu and a doorman who clearly recognized Dante by name, ushering them inside with the deference usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. The interior was intimate and warm, all exposed brick and candlelight, with the soft murmur of conversations conducted in multiple languages. Ava felt simultaneously underdressed and enchanted as they were led to a corner table that somehow managed to feel both private and part of the restaurant's elegant atmosphere. "You look beautiful," Dante said as they settled into their seats, and the simple honesty in his voice made her heart flutter in a way that felt dangerous. She had spent an hour choosing her outfit, finally settling on a simple black dress that was the nicest thing she owned, paired with heels that made her legs look longer even though they would leave her feet aching by the end of the evening. Seeing the way Dante's eyes lingered on her face, the genuine appreciation in his expression made every minute of preparation feel worthwhile. "This place is incredible," she said, taking in the oil paintings of Italian countryside scenes and the soft jazz that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "How did you find it?" "La Famiglia," he replied with a slight smile. "Family connections. The owner's grandfather and mine were friends in the old country. Some relationships survived generations." There was something in his voice when he said family, a weight that suggested complicated loyalties and obligations. But before Ava could analyze it further, their waiter appeared with wine that Dante must have ordered in advance, a rich Brunello that tasted like it cost more than her monthly rent. "Tell me about your grandmother," Dante said as they shared antipasti that arrived without being ordered. "You mentioned she came from Abruzzo." Ava found herself settling into the story she loved most, about Nana Rose's journey from a mountain village to New York Harbor with nothing but hope and determination. She spoke of her grandmother's hands, always moving, always creating, whether kneading dough or tending the small garden she grew on the fire escape of their tenement apartment. "She taught me that food was love made visible," Ava said, watching Dante's face in the candlelight. Every recipe came with stories, with memories of people who were gone, but lived on in the taste of their favorite dishes. "When she made her mother's ragu, she said she could feel her spirit in the kitchen with us." "E bellissimo," Dante murmured, his voice soft with something that might have been emotion. "That's beautiful." My own Nana had similar beliefs. She always said that breaking bread together was sacred, that it bound people in ways that words never could. The conversation flowed between English and Italian as naturally as breathing, each language bringing out different aspects of their personalities. In English, they were careful, polite, maintaining the subtle distance of two people still learning each other. In Italian, something deeper emerged, a connection to heritage and emotion that made their words feel more honest, more intimate. "Mia Famiglia came from Calabria originally," Dante said, refilling her wine glass with careful attention. "My great-grandfather, Salvatore, arrived in New York in 1923 with $40 and a promise to his wife that he would send for her within 2 years. Did he keep his promise?" Ava asked, leaning forward despite herself. "He did, but it cost him everything he thought he was. The legitimate work couldn't support bringing over his family, couldn't give them the life he had promised. So he made choices, alliances, that changed the course of our entire family." There was something in Dante's voice that made Ava's wine taste suddenly bitter, a darkness that suggested those choices had consequences rippling down through the generations. But when his phone buzzed against the table, interrupting the moment, she saw something else entirely cross his face. Not guilt, but a kind of weary acceptance. "Skusami," he said, glancing at the screen. "I need to take this." He stepped away from the table, moving toward the restaurant's entrance while speaking in rapid, low Italian that Ava couldn't quite catch. But she could see his posture change, the relaxed dinner companion replaced by someone issuing instructions with quiet authority. Whatever business he conducted, it clearly didn't pause for romantic dinners. When he returned, his expression had shifted back to warmth, but Ava had seen enough to understand that there were parts of Dante's life that existed in shadows she couldn't penetrate. "Sorry," he said, sitting back down and reaching for her hand across the table. "Where were we?" His fingers were warm and strong, and the simple contact sent electricity racing up her arm. She should ask about the phone call, should probe the hints of danger that seemed to surround him like cologne. Instead, she found herself telling him about her own dreams, about the little restaurant she fantasized about opening someday, serving the recipes Nana Rosa had taught her alongside new creations of her own. "You have the passion for it," Dante said, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "And the knowledge. What's stopping you?" "Money," Ava admitted with a laugh that held no humor. "Everything comes down to money. Rent for a space, equipment, permits, staff. I've been saving for 3 years, and I'm nowhere close to having enough for even the smallest place." "What if money weren't an obstacle?" he asked, his dark eyes intense in the candlelight. "What if someone believed in your dream enough to invest in it?" The question hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. There would be strings attached to an offer like that, obligations and expectations that went far beyond simple business partnership. She was beginning to understand that nothing about Dante Caruso was simple. "I'd want to earn it," she said finally, "not have it given to me." His smile was slow and genuine, transforming his face into something that made her breath catch. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." They shared dessert, a tiramisu that was somehow both rich and light, feeding each other small bites while their conversation ranged from books to music to the differences between northern and southern Italian cooking traditions. Ava found herself laughing more than she had in months, relaxing into Dante's attention in ways that felt both natural and terrifying. When he walked her back toward the street where his car was parked, their hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining as if they had been doing this for years rather than hours. The wine had left her feeling warm and loose, more willing to lean into the attraction that had been building between them for weeks. Under a streetlight that cast golden circles on the sidewalk, Dante stopped walking and turned to face her fully. They were alone on the quiet street, surrounded by the distant sounds of the city, but feeling completely isolated in their bubble of possibility. "Ava," he said, her name a whisper that seemed to contain multitudes. She looked up at him, taking in the sharp angles of his face softened by shadow and light, the way his dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart race. She could feel the danger radiating from him, the sense that loving this man would change her life in ways she couldn't predict or control. But she could also feel his gentleness, the careful way he touched her, as if she were something precious and fragile. When he lowered his head toward hers, she rose on her toes to meet him halfway, their lips connecting in a kiss that was soft and searching and completely devastating. He tasted like wine and possibility, and when his hand came up to cradle the back of her head, threading through her dark hair, she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The kiss deepened slowly, carefully, as if they both understood that this moment was changing everything between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Ava found herself looking at a man she wanted desperately despite every rational instinct telling her to run. "I should take you home," Dante said, but his voice was rough with wanting, and his forehead remained pressed against hers. "You should," she agreed, but neither of them moved to break the connection, to step out of the golden circle of light that seemed to hold them suspended between the world they had known and whatever came next. When his phone buzzed again in his pocket, the spell finally broke. He stepped back reluctantly, checking the message with a frown that suggested whatever business demanded his attention couldn't wait. "I have to go," he said, genuine regret in his voice. but I'll see you soon. Very soon. As she watched him disappear into the night, Ava touched her lips where the taste of him still lingered, knowing that whatever came next, she was already lost. 3 days after their first date, Ava was wiping down tables during the afternoon lull when two men in expensive suits entered Bella Vista. Something about their presence immediately set her on edge. The way they surveyed the dining room like predators evaluating territory rather than customers seeking a meal. They were both tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident swagger that suggested they were accustomed to getting their way through intimidation rather than charm. The older of the two had graying temples and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they encountered. His companion appeared younger, but carried himself with the same dangerous energy that made Ava's instincts scream warnings. The hostess, Jennifer, approached them with her usual professional smile, but Ava could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she stepped back slightly when the older man spoke to her. Within moments, Jennifer was pointing in Ava's direction, and both men turned their attention toward her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She considered disappearing into the kitchen, claiming she was needed for prep work, but they were already approaching her table. Running would only confirm whatever suspicions had brought them here, and she forced herself to stand straighter, to meet their gaze with as much composure as she could manage. Ava Moretti, the older man said, and it wasn't a question. You've been spending time with Dante Caruso. The way he said Dante's name, with a mixture of respect and barely contained hostility, told her everything she needed to know about these men and the world they represented. This wasn't about restaurant reservations or dinner recommendations. This was about territory and power and the dangerous game she had unknowingly entered by accepting Dante's attention. I'm sorry, she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. Do I know you? The younger man smiled, but there was nothing warm about the expression. You don't need to know us, sweetheart. You just need to understand that your boyfriend has been making some people very unhappy lately. Mr. Caruso is a customer, Ava replied, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Whatever business you have with him doesn't involve me. Oh, but it does, the older man said, stepping closer until she could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. When you're sleeping with the enemy, you become part of the conversation. And right now, that conversation is about to get very unpleasant. Ava felt trapped between their bodies and the table behind her, acutely aware of how isolated this corner of the restaurant had become. The few afternoon diners were absorbed in their own conversations, oblivious to the drama unfolding across the room. Even if she screamed, what could they really do against men who clearly operated outside the normal rules of society? I think you've confused me with someone else, she said, hating how small her voice sounded. I'm just a waitress. I don't know anything about anyone's business. The younger man laughed, a sound that made her skin crawl. Everyone's just something until they're not. Until they see things they shouldn't see, hear things that weren't meant for their ears. Caruso's got a weakness for pretty faces, but that doesn't mean you're protected. Before either man could respond, Ava felt a familiar presence behind her, a shift in the atmosphere that made the temperature seem to drop several degrees. She didn't need to turn around to know that Dante had arrived, but when she did, the transformation in his appearance from the gentle man who had kissed her under streetlights was so complete it took her breath away. Gentlemen, Dante said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made both intruders take an involuntary step backward. I believe you're lost. This isn't your territory. The older man's confident demeanor faltered slightly, but he rallied with visible effort. Just having a friendly conversation, Caruso. Getting to know your new friend here. Dante moved to stand beside Ava, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the barely leashed violence that seemed to pulse beneath his composed exterior. When she glanced at his face, she saw a stranger, someone capable of things she had tried not to imagine. The conversation is over, Dante said, and something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. I suggest you return to your own concerns and forget you ever saw her. The two men exchanged a look that spoke of calculations being made, odds being weighed. Whatever they saw in Dante's expression apparently convinced them that pressing the issue would be unwise. The older man adjusted his tie with forced casualness. Of course, he said. No harm intended. We were just leaving. As they walked away, moving with the careful dignity of men who had been outmaneuvered but weren't ready to admit it. Dante remained motionless beside her. Ava could feel the tension radiating from his body, see the muscle jumping in his jaw as he watched them exit the restaurant. "Are you all right?" he asked once they were gone, his voice gentler but still carrying an edge that made her shiver. "I think so," Ava said, though she realized her hands were shaking as she reached for her abandoned cleaning cloth. "Who were they? What did they want?" Dante's expression grew grim. "Competition. Men who think my personal life affects our business arrangements. They wanted to send a message." "What kind of message?" she asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. "That you're a vulnerability they can exploit," Dante said bluntly. "That caring about you makes me weak." The honesty in his voice, the matter-of-fact way he said caring about you, sent warmth flooding through her chest despite the fear still coursing through her veins. But the implications of what he was saying gradually sank in, painting a picture of her life that looked very different than the safe routine she had built for herself. "This is going to happen again, isn't it?" she said. "As long as we're whatever we are, I'm going to be a target." "Yes," Dante said simply, "which is why you're coming home with me tonight. And every night until this is resolved." The presumption in his voice should have made her angry, but instead she found herself considering the offer with a desperation that surprised her. The thought of returning to her shared apartment, of walking alone through dark streets while wondering if men like those were watching from shadows, made her stomach clench with anxiety. "I can't just abandon my life," she protested weakly. "You don't have to abandon anything," Dante said, his hand finally coming up to touch her cheek with infinite gentleness. "But you can't pretend that dating me doesn't come with consequences. I should have warned you, should have been more careful. But now that they know about you, hiding won't make you safer." An hour later, Ava found herself in the passenger seat of Dante's car, a hastily packed overnight bag in her lap, and her mind reeling from how quickly her carefully ordered life had been turned upside down. The penthouse he brought her to was everything she had expected and nothing she was prepared for. The space was enormous, taking up the entire top floor of a building that overlooked the Hudson River. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city, while the interior was decorated with the kind of understated luxury that spoke of serious wealth. Art that looked museum quality hung on walls painted in warm neutrals, and furniture that was clearly custom-made filled the open living spaces. But it was the security measures that truly drove home the reality of Dante's world. Cameras in every corner, reinforced glass that was clearly bulletproof, and an elevator that required a special key card to access their floor. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. "Make yourself comfortable," Dante said, setting down her bag and moving toward a bar cart filled with expensive spirits. "Can I get you something to drink? This has been a difficult day." As if summoned by his words, his phone began ringing with the urgent insistence that she had learned meant business. Dante glanced at the screen, and his expression darkened. "I need to take this," he said apologetically. "There are consequences for what happened today, arrangements that need to be made." She nodded, settling onto a leather sofa that probably cost more than her annual salary, and tried not to listen as Dante paced to the windows and began speaking in rapid Italian. But his voice carried in the open space, and she caught enough fragments to understand that he was discussing retribution, territory, and men who had overstepped boundaries. When two more men arrived 20 minutes later, admitted by a security system that clearly recognized them, Ava realized she was about to witness exactly what kind of business Dante conducted. They were younger than the men who had threatened her, but they carried the same aura of controlled violence, the same deference when addressing Dante. The meeting that followed was conducted entirely in Italian, but Ava's fluency meant she understood every word. They discussed the afternoon's incident with clinical precision, analyzing motivations and planning responses. She learned that Dante controlled significant territory in Little Italy and beyond, that the men who had threatened her represented a rival family testing boundaries, and that the consequences for their boldness would be swift and decisive. She should have been horrified, should have grabbed her bag and demanded to be taken home immediately. Instead, she found herself studying Dante's face as he spoke, seeing the intelligence and strategic thinking that had built whatever empire he commanded. There was no cruelty in his planning, no unnecessary violence. just the calculated responses of someone who understood that weakness invited aggression. When his associates left an hour later, Dante returned to where she sat curled on his sofa, his expression uncertain as he searched her face for signs of judgment or fear. "Now you know," he said quietly. "This is who I am, what I do. If you want to leave, I'll have someone drive you home and make sure you're protected. But I won't lie to you anymore about the life I live." Ava looked into his dark eyes, seeing vulnerability beneath the power, and realized that despite everything she had learned, despite the danger that came with loving him, she didn't want to leave. She wanted to stay in this fortress, wanted to build something real with this complicated man who had shown her tenderness she had never known existed. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, reaching for his hand and feeling his fingers tighten around hers. "If this is your world, then I want to be part of it. I want to be part of you." Ava woke to darkness and the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Her head throbbed where something had struck her, and when she tried to move, she discovered her hands were bound behind her back with rope that bit into her wrists. The smell of motor oil and dampness told her she was in some kind of warehouse, though she couldn't remember how she had gotten here. The last thing she recalled was leaving Bella Vista after her shift, walking toward the corner where Dante's driver usually waited for her. Then footsteps behind her, a cloth pressed against her face, and the world dissolving into chemical darkness. Terror clawed at her throat as consciousness fully returned. This was what Dante had warned her about, what he had tried to protect her from by bringing her to his fortress every night for the past 2 weeks. But she had insisted on maintaining some normalcy, on continuing to work, and now his enemies had found their opportunity. Voices echoed from somewhere in the cavernous space, men speaking in the same mix of English and Italian she had learned to associate with Dante's world. But these voices carried a different energy, cruder and more violent than the controlled discussions she had witnessed in his penthouse. "She's awake," one of them called out, and footsteps approached her position on what felt like a concrete floor. The older man from the restaurant materialized out of the shadows, the same cold blue eyes now bright with satisfaction. He crouched down beside her, close enough that she could smell stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. "Hello again, sweetheart," he said with mock gentleness. "Sorry about the accommodations, but we needed somewhere private to conduct our business. What do you want?" Ava managed through dry lips, proud that her voice didn't shake despite the fear coursing through her body. "Nothing from you directly," he replied, standing and brushing imaginary dust from his expensive suit. "You're just the message we're sending to your boyfriend. A reminder that he's not as untouchable as he thinks." The implications of being used as a message, as something disposable in whatever game these men were playing, sent ice through her veins. But underneath the terror, something else was building. Anger. Fury at being reduced to a pawn, at having her life threatened to hurt the man she was falling in love with. "He'll come for me," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Oh, we're counting on it," the man replied with a smile that made her skin crawl. "The question is whether he'll come alone like we demanded, or whether he'll be stupid enough to start a war over one little waitress." The casual dismissal of her worth, the assumption that Dante might weigh her value against the cost of conflict, hit her harder than she expected. But even as doubt crept in, she remembered the tenderness in his voice when he called her Cara, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the careful way he touched her as if she were something precious. He would come. She knew that with certainty that surprised her. Hours passed in the darkness, measured by the changing positions of shadows and the gradually increasing pain in her wrists and shoulders. The men guarding her rotated shifts, but their conversation remained focused on Dante's expected arrival and the terms they planned to demand for her release. When the first sounds of violence erupted from the far end of the warehouse, sharp cracks that could only be gunfire, Ava felt her heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. The men around her moved with sudden urgency, shouting instructions and drawing weapons from concealment. The battle was brief but decisive. Dante's voice cut through the chaos, issuing commands in rapid Italian that his men followed with military precision. There were more gunshots, screams of pain, and then an abrupt silence that was somehow more terrifying than the violence had been. When footsteps approached her position again, Ava held her breath until Dante's familiar silhouette appeared against the dim emergency lighting. His dark suit was torn and blood-stained, his face grim with barely controlled fury, but his hands were infinitely gentle as he knelt to untie her bonds. "Cara mia," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he gathered her against his chest. "Did they hurt you? Tell me if they hurt you." The relief of being in his arms, of breathing his familiar cologne instead of motor oil and fear, nearly overwhelmed her. She pressed her face against his neck and felt something fundamental shift in her chest. This man had risked everything to find her, had brought violence and destruction down on his enemies without hesitation because she mattered to him. "I'm okay," she managed, though her voice was muffled against his skin. "I knew you would come." "Always," Dante said fiercely, pressing his lips to her hair. "Always, Ava. No one takes what's mine and lives to profit from it." The possessiveness in his voice should have alarmed her, but instead it sent warmth flooding through her body. She wanted to be his, wanted to belong to someone who would move mountains to keep her safe, who would wage war against anyone who threatened her. The ride back to his penthouse passed in relative silence, Dante's arm around her shoulders while he conducted urgent phone conversations with his lieutenants. The aftermath of what had happened tonight would require careful management, she realized. Bodies would need to disappear, witnesses would need to be silenced or bought, and rival families would need to understand that crossing Dante Caruso came with deadly consequences. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't afraid of the violence or the implications of loving a dangerous man. She had seen what he was capable of when she was threatened, and instead of horror, she felt profound gratitude for his protection. Back in the safety of his fortress, Dante's composed exterior finally cracked. His hands shook as he examined her wrists for rope burns, his jaw clenched with suppressed rage as he cataloged every scratch and bruise she had suffered during her captivity. "I should never have let you continue working," he said, his voice thick with self-recrimination. "Should never have given them the opportunity to take you." "This isn't your fault," Ava said, catching his hands in hers and feeling the tension thrumming through his body. "You warned me about the risks. I chose to take them." But when his dark eyes met hers, she saw something beyond guilt and anger. She saw fear, raw and devastating, the terror of a man who had almost lost something irreplaceable. The realization that she had that kind of power over him, that her safety mattered more to him than his own, sent her heart racing for entirely different reasons. Without thinking, she rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her gratitude and relief and growing love into the contact. His response was immediate and desperate, his arms coming around her with fierce possessiveness as he deepened the kiss. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Ava saw her own need reflected in his dark eyes. The adrenaline of surviving, of being reunited after genuine terror, had transformed into something else entirely. She wanted to celebrate being alive, wanted to claim him as thoroughly as he had claimed her. But when she tried to push his jacket from his shoulders, she discovered blood soaking through the fabric of his shirt. Her hands came away crimson, and concern immediately overrode desire. "You're hurt," she said, her voice sharp with worry. "It's nothing," Dante protested, but she was already unbuttoning his shirt with careful fingers, revealing a bullet graze along his ribs that was still bleeding sluggishly. "This is not nothing," she said firmly, guiding him toward his bathroom, where she had noticed a well-stocked first aid kit during her previous stays. Tending his wound gave her something to focus on besides the magnitude of what had happened tonight, the way her life had irrevocably changed in the span of a few hours. Her hands remained steady as she cleaned the graze and applied antibiotic ointment, though her heart raced at the intimacy of touching his bare skin. "You're very good at this," Dante observed, watching her face as she worked. "Nana Rosa believed in being prepared," Ava replied, securing the bandage with careful precision. "She taught me basic first aid along with everything else." When she finished, they remained frozen in tableau, her hands on his chest and his eyes dark with wanting. The bathroom felt too small to contain the tension building between them, the awareness that they had crossed some invisible threshold tonight that could never be uncrossed. "Ava," Dante said, her name a question and a promise combined. Instead of answering with words, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to the skin just above his bandage, a gentle kiss that acknowledged his pain while celebrating his survival. His sharp intake of breath told her everything she needed to know about his control, about how close he was to losing the careful restraint he had maintained throughout their courtship. When she looked up at him, she made her choice with complete clarity. Tonight had shown her that loving him meant accepting all of him, violence and tenderness combined. It meant choosing passion over safety, connection over comfort. "I love you," she said simply, the words emerging with startling ease. "I love all of you." His response was to lift her into his arms and carry her to his bedroom, where they made love with the desperate intensity of two people who had almost lost each other forever. Every touch was both claim and surrender, every kiss a promise that they belonged to each other completely. The transformation began 3 weeks after Ava's rescue, when Dante announced to his assembled lieutenants that the family business would be shifting toward legitimate enterprises. The meeting took place in his penthouse, with Ava present for the first time as more than just a protected asset, but as someone whose input he actively sought. The restaurant industry, Dante explained to men who had spent their careers managing protection rackets and territorial disputes, offered opportunities for growth that didn't require constantly looking over their shoulders. With Ava's expertise in service and operations, combined with his understanding of finance and logistics, they could build an empire that generated wealth without generating federal investigations. Some of his men struggled with the transition. Tony Benedetto, who had been with Dante since the beginning, voiced concerns about appearing weak to rival families, about abandoning the traditions that had built their power. But when he saw the quiet steel in Ava's eyes as she outlined her vision for authentic Italian dining experiences, he began to understand that this woman wasn't making Dante soft. She was making him strategic. The first restaurant they acquired was a failing establishment in Little Italy, a place with good bones but poor management. Ava threw herself into the renovation with passion that reminded Dante why he had fallen in love with her determination. She worked 18-hour days designing menus, training staff, and ensuring every detail reflected the authentic Italian experience she remembered from Nana Rosa's stories. But their transition to legitimacy didn't go unnoticed by Dante's enemies. Vincent Torino, the man who had orchestrated Ava's kidnapping, had survived his organization's destruction and spent months rebuilding his network. He saw Dante's shift toward legal businesses as weakness to exploit, an opportunity to reclaim territory and respect through decisive action. The attack came on a Tuesday evening, just as their first restaurant was finding its rhythm. Ava was in the kitchen, working alongside their head chef to perfect a new ragu recipe, when the front windows exploded inward under a hail of gunfire. The dining room erupted into chaos as customers dove for cover and staff scrambled for the emergency exits. Dante's security team responded immediately, returning fire from positions they had prepared for exactly this scenario. But Vincent's men had come prepared for war, with automatic weapons and enough determination to turn the elegant dining room into a battlefield. Through the chaos, Ava heard Dante's voice cutting through the noise, issuing rapid commands in Italian as he coordinated his men's response. She caught glimpses of him moving through the restaurant with deadly precision, no longer the gentle man who read poetry to her in the evenings, but the predator who had built an empire through strategic violence. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but the aftermath would require hours of careful cleanup. Bodies were removed by men who specialized in making problems disappear, while others worked to repair the damage and eliminate evidence of what had truly transpired. By dawn, the restaurant looked as if nothing had happened, ready to open for business as usual. But Vincent Torino's body was never found, because Dante had ensured he wouldn't be making any more attempts to threaten their new life together. Some conversations required privacy, and some problems needed permanent solutions that couldn't be achieved through negotiation or legal channels. As their restaurant empire grew over the following months, Ava discovered talents she had never known she possessed. Her ability to create authentic experiences attracted customers who became devoted regulars, while her understanding of operations helped optimize everything from inventory management to staff scheduling. What had started as one struggling establishment became 3 profitable locations, with plans for expansion that extended beyond New York. Dante's family embraced her with warmth that surprised them both. His mother, Elena Caruso, was a small, elegant woman in her 70s who had spent decades worrying that her son would never find someone capable of seeing past his dangerous reputation to the good man underneath. When she met Ava, she recognized a kindred spirit, another woman who understood that love sometimes meant accepting complexity that others couldn't comprehend. Sunday dinners at the family home became sacred traditions, with Ava learning recipes that had been passed down through 4 generations while sharing stories of her own grandmother's culinary wisdom. She discovered that Dante's family had maintained their Italian heritage through food and tradition, creating a bridge between the old country and their American dreams that felt familiar and comforting. The proposal came on Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after their first date at Luna Rossa. Dante had arranged for them to have the restaurant to themselves, recreating their first evening together with the same wine and the same intimate corner table. But this time, when dessert arrived, there was a ring nestled beside the tiramisu, a stunning vintage design that looked like something from his grandmother's era. "Sposami," he said in Italian, the language that had first connected them. "Marry me, Ava. Build this life with me." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her finger all along. Later, she learned that it had belonged to Nonna Francesca, passed down through generations of Caruso women who had understood that love was worth whatever risks came with it. Their wedding took place 6 months later in the garden of the family estate, a celebration that blended both their traditions with guests who ranged from former rivals turned business partners to elderly customers from their restaurants. Giuseppe, the man whose need for help had first brought them together, served as an honored guest, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he watched the young woman who had shown him kindness pledge her life to the dangerous man who had learned gentleness through loving her. The ceremony was conducted in both English and Italian, with vows that acknowledged the complexity of their union. They promised to protect each other through whatever challenges their chosen life might bring, to build something beautiful together despite the shadows that would always follow them. Their honeymoon in Italy was a pilgrimage to the places their grandparents had described in stories, a chance to walk the streets of Roccascalegna and taste the foods that had shaped their heritage. In the mountain villages of Abruzzo, surrounded by landscapes that seemed unchanged by time, they made plans for their future that extended beyond restaurants and business ventures. They returned to New York with new understanding of their shared identity and renewed commitment to building something that honored both their family's sacrifices and their own dreams. The third restaurant they opened was designed as a tribute to their grandmothers, featuring recipes from both their family traditions alongside new creations that reflected their combined vision. 2 years after their wedding, Ava stood in the kitchen of their flagship restaurant, one hand pressed against her gently rounded belly as she supervised the evening prep. Their business had grown beyond anything they had originally imagined, with locations in 3 cities and plans for international expansion that would take them back to Italy within the decade. Dante appeared behind her, his arms coming around her waist as he pressed a gentle kiss to her neck. The dangerous man who had once survived through violence and intimidation had been transformed by love into someone who found his greatest satisfaction in building rather than destroying. "How are you feeling, cara mia?" he asked, his hand joining hers on her belly where their child grew. "Perfect," she replied, leaning back against his chest as she watched their staff prepare for another successful evening. "Everything is perfect." Their love story had become legend in Little Italy, whispered between the older women who remembered when such romances only existed in movies. They spoke of the waitress who had spoken Italian to a lonely old man and captured the heart of the most dangerous bachelor in the neighborhood, of the crime boss who had transformed his empire for love, of the family they had built together that proved redemption was possible for anyone willing to choose tenderness over violence. In the evenings, after the restaurants closed and their staff had gone home, Dante and Ava would walk through the streets where their story had begun. Sometimes they stopped at Luna Rossa, now under their ownership, where they would share a bottle of wine and remember the night when a simple kiss under streetlights had changed everything. Their child would grow up knowing both sides of their heritage, learning to make pasta by hand while understanding the importance of building something legitimate and beautiful. The baby would hear stories of great-grandparents who had crossed oceans for opportunity, of grandmothers who had preserved traditions through recipes and remembrance, and of parents who had found each other through the simple act of kindness toward a stranger. 5 years later, when Giuseppe celebrated his 80th birthday at their newest location, he raised a toast to the couple whose chance meeting had created an empire built on love and authenticity. He spoke in Italian about the magic that happened when good people found each other, about the way small acts of kindness could change the course of entire lives. Ava translated his words for the younger staff members, her voice warm with the same compassion that had first caught Dante's attention. Their daughter, now 3 years old, sat on her father's lap, giggling as he whispered Italian endearments that made her dark eyes sparkle with mischief inherited from both her parents. The restaurant empire they had built together employed over 200 people, providing opportunities for immigrants and young people who needed second chances. Their charitable foundation, funded by profits from legitimate businesses, supported programs that helped other families navigate the challenges of preserving culture while building American dreams. But success measured in numbers meant less to them than the quiet satisfaction of having created something beautiful together, something that honored their grandmother's memories while providing a foundation for their children's futures. Every evening when they closed their restaurants and returned home together, they were reminded that the greatest accomplishment of their lives wasn't the business empire or the financial security, but the love they had built from a chance encounter and nurtured through every challenge that followed. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they stood on the terrace of their penthouse overlooking the city where their story had begun, Dante pulled Ava close and whispered the same words he had spoken on Christmas Eve years earlier. "Sposami," he said, though they were already married, already committed, already bound together by love and children and shared dreams. "Marry me again every day, Ava. Choose this life with me again and again." "Si," she replied, the Italian word for yes that had become their private language of love. "Today and always, for as long as we both shall live." Their story had become proof that love could transform anyone, that kindness had the power to change destinies, and that sometimes the most unlikely romances created the strongest foundations for lasting happiness. In the restaurant business they had built together, in the family they had created, in the community they served, their love continued to create ripples of positive change that extended far beyond their own lives. And in the kitchen of their newest restaurant, where a young waitress was learning to speak Italian so she could better serve their elderly customers, their legacy lived on through the simple understanding that treating people with compassion and dignity was the most powerful force in the world.